The following was recorded in front of a live studio audience at the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. This is the United Podcast Network.
This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacey.
Thank you, and welcome to another episode of Voices in Validation, a podcast bringing you timely interviews with industry experts from pharma, biotech, medical devices, and life science manufacturing. This week, we are pleased to welcome back Roberta Goode. So happy to have you here today with us, Roberta. Roberta is a wealth of knowledge in the medical device arena, and I invited her back today to speak about the essentials of designing for manufacturability and medical device products. So welcome, Roberta.
Thank you, Stacey. It's always a pleasure to be with you and your audience.
Likewise. Thank you so much. Roberta, before we dive in, to the questions, I know this topic, 8 essentials of designing for manufacturability. Can you just give us a quick rundown of what those 8 highlights or steps are?
Sure thing. Well, one of the challenges with designing for manufacturability is, as the acronym implies, DFMA, is that there's an A at the end.
Right.
So we've got to consider designing for manufacturability and assembly. And many folks think that's the same thing, but it's not. So as I give you the 8 steps, perhaps I could elucidate that a little bit.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, essentially the steps are gathering functional requirements. I'll just give these at a high level, if that's okay, Stacey.
Right, we can dive into some later, yes.
Yeah, we'll dive in later. So we want to gather our functional requirements and really understand what the parts that we're making are supposed to do and what is essential to the customer in terms of usability, human factors, and what is just kind of in many of these legacy devices, we have leftover elements for functionality that are no longer relevant.
Right.
Next, we'll perform a functional analysis, which includes identifying which parts can be standardized. For example, you know how it is the night before your child's birthday, you're putting together a bicycle or a 3D printer probably nowadays.
Right.
And you've got 16 screws, 8 of one kind and 8 of another kind, but they're almost identical and you can't really easily tell them apart.
Sure.
There's just a slight difference, say, in the length. These are opportunities for standardization of parts so that we can make assembly more efficient, as we all know who've been up late with the toys.
Absolutely.
Then we'll implement some tools, and these will be in the show notes. I understand you've incorporated them into the show notes.
Correct.
Some of these great tools, there are spreadsheets and formulae that allow us to actually determine the part count efficiencies. In other words, which parts can we take away, and by standardization and other efficiencies, can we eliminate some of the extraneous components? This, of course, also saves in manufacturing and supplier quality elements. Next, we'll identify Poka-Yoke opportunities, which, in case anyone out there in your audience isn't familiar with that term, Poka-Yoke is a Japanese term that essentially translates to avoidance of inadvertent error. Basically, coming up with techniques, jigs, little tricks to prevent us from misassembling a part that could perhaps go in to the fixture, say, 2 different ways.
Okay, makes sense.
And then ultimately, as we move into into the manufacturing, these are mostly assembly elements, we'll look at opportunities to minimize manufacturing complexity, including that for complex tooling such as molds. Okay. And this will save us a lot of money if we look at it up front.
Excellent. Well, thank you for giving us a high-level rundown of those. We will talk in depth about all of those elements, some more than others in our discussion. But by the title of today's podcast, it should be clear that you've boiled DFMA. down to 8 essential steps. We'll review each of them today in today's podcast, but let's walk through the first 2 essential steps of designing for manufacturability, beginning with gather and analyze functional requirements. Can you talk more about that?
Of course I can. Would it be all right if I begin, though, with just a quick example of the difference between manufacturing and assembly? I think this is an area of a lot of confusion, and if we start off on a good foundation, I think
I agree. I think a lot of people think manufacturing and assembly are one concurrent thing, but they're really not. They're 2 different activities, and they need to be, so please, if you could.
Thanks. Just at a high level, and there are, again, in the show notes, references to additional reading for folks who want to get a little deeper dive on these differences. But here's an example I like to use in training. For example, let's say you have a 7-piece design, and you're injection molding. Perhaps it's made of a plastic. So you're injection molding this design, and you can reduce it to a 1-piece assembly. So we would eliminate 6 parts. Let's just say theoretically we could do so. But by performing this molding of this one part, this very complex part, we have so many intricate features now that we've introduced into the tooling that it is so expensive. And we know, those of us who are in the design world and, making prototypes with aluminum prototype molds, and then we go to purchase our steel molds for production. I mean, this is just manufacturable. It's too expensive. It can be done, but it's too expensive. So that's an example of where we think we're improving and simplifying, but we've actually not considered the manufacturability of that simplified design, if that makes any sense.
Yes, of course.
So it's about cost of tooling. That's the manufacturing kind of caveat, if you keep that in mind. Now, the second, to explain sort of the assembly, let's say you've got a 1-piece stamping that's designed for an electronic circuit board, and we're stamping the circuit board housing. But say that the sides of the housing, which used to be separate pieces, but now we've got this 1-piece stamp, now they impede the ability for our assemblers to actually get their hands in there to those fastening locations for soldering and whatnot. So we've saved money in manufacturing, but now it can't be assembled because we can't get our hands in there to do the soldering work. So I think that just gives a little bit of a general, kind of a tangible, real-world idea of the differences. Tooling cost is a manufacturability design element, and the ability to actually get our hands in there and assemble the parts, that's designing for assembly.
Right. So you need 2 different teams of people coming together sometimes to make sure that, you're not just getting too focused in on your particular area of this process.
That's right. It's absolutely correct. And in fact, when we look at ISO 13485, the quality management system, and 21 CFR 820, quality system regulation, we know that there are requirements in the regulations to have a transfer, a design transfer to production that includes close association between manufacturing and design. And for these very reasons, what we don't always have, Stacey, is the kind of the practical skills for how to go about that. And that's what we're going to have today in our podcast.
Excellent. Excellent.
So I'll jump into the first 2.
Gather and analyze functional requirements. Let's hop right in.
I thought we would start with something really simple. So I have one of these staple removers.
Right. Yeah.
And so this simple design, the claw design, we're going to use this to evaluate. It's just as an example of how to evaluate the design. So when we gather functional requirements, what we really want to do is understand how this product works. What are the preliminary specifications? By the way, this is a great opportunity for your listeners to implement design of experiments.
Yes. Okay.
Right, which often happens in the OQ stage in process validation, but in design, we'll do this up front. That will allow us to really know, what does this need to do, and what is extraneous and what is essential. Then step 2 then is to move on to our functional analysis, which has 3 rules, just briefly. First, we assume that the base of whatever part it is we're looking at is essential.
Yes.
The base is considered an essential part. Now, second rule, we assume that the fasteners, the spacers, washers, O-rings, connectors, etc., these are always non-essential parts because we always have the opportunity to create a one-piece design or to minimize the number of separate components, joining them in some way. And third, and speaking of joining, liquids such as glues, sealants, lubricants, adhesives, these do not count as parts.
Okay.
Okay, so that kind of is how we begin our first two steps in our functional analysis. By the way, if your audience members have a process map showing the assembly sequence, that is a super helpful tool to have at this point. Earlier in the design process, we might not have that, but if it's available, it's useful. So the best way to really kind of dive in to figure out what's essential and what's not essential is to take the tool apart, take the product, the device apart.
Okay.
So I have a little image. I don't know how well it'll show on video, but you see I disassembled that staple remover, and there are rivets and an upper jaw and a lower jaw. It kind of gives just an idea of generally how we would approach this.
Sure.
Shall I keep going?
Yeah. So I do have a follow-up question.
Please.
Because you mentioned that adhesives, lubricants, things like that are not considered parts, should change control have to come in, and obviously later, once it's on the market, is that something you need to, let's say your adhesive manufacturer suddenly doesn't have the product you've always been buying and now you have to replace it. Since it's not actually considered a part, do you have to record that or account for that?
Wow, that's a great question, Stacey. Of course you do, of course, and I'm sure you know the answer to that one right before you ask me. But for your audience,
I do, but I just want the explanation because
of course.
People listening to this, especially if they're new to this space, they might not understand, right? That just because it's not a part, it's still something that needs to be considered and logged appropriately.
You are absolutely right, and I'm really glad for the question. Actually, it's true. It is essential that all components have to be traceable throughout the entire product life cycle, from the first raw material through the components, through the sub-assemblies, top assembly, and then all the way through its distribution and use over its product life cycle and clinical realm in the field. Design change in particular is a real sticky area where we have many illustrious examples of, all the way from, nuclear reactors to the Hindenburg, seriously, of where last minute design changes were found ultimately upon investigation to have been the root causes of those amazing failures. So yes, even if part is not part, the purposes of DFMA science, it is certainly required to track and trace and document and validate in many cases, or at least give a rationale for why re-verification and revalidation of that part is not necessary.
Right. Thank you. I want to, that clarification is important. Thank you.
You're right. I'm really glad you asked that. Thank you. So as we move forward with our functional analysis, we're going to figure out the number of each kind of part. In other words, we have 2 or 4 rivets, we have 16 screws, we have a top. So, if you will, so we'll look at current designs for each part. We'll consider specifications, which includes not just the product specs, those technical product specs that we're still really working on, but really more to the point, the user specs. Whether we call that the market specification or the user specification, what is it that we really need? Does someone really need to be able to make a compressive motion? Or do they just need to get the staple out of the paper?
Right.
They need to get the staple out.
Right. And that's
That's
why there
right.
are different versions of staple removers.
That's right, exactly. So again, with some of the tools, the design for assembly analysis worksheets and so on that are available online, we can, in the public domain, in fact, we can begin to look at each part to determine if it can be standardized, and if each part should be standardized, if we even need all those parts. So that kind of wraps up the answer to your first question, I think.
Thank you. Yes. So that's a perfect segue into my next question, because as you're reviewing your design, your functionality at the beginning, and determining exactly what are the must-haves and what are the sort of non-essential items, I would think that DFMA then this process is all about streamlining, right? And creating product efficiency, as you alluded to. So I can imagine that standardization of materials reduces material costs, but does it also help shorten the product development cycle? So maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
By all means, thank you again. That's a very insightful question, Stacey. It does so. We have fewer elements to consider and less complexity. Part by part, just come along, we know we have fewer drawings now, and perhaps we've eliminated a supplier or two that we have to be concerned about along the way. But really more appreciably, I think, for those of us in design who've also worked in manufacturing, we eliminate untold complexity in the manufacturing and assembly process. That's where we're dogged for, that's really where the payoffs lie. Not just in the design area and the design V&V activities, but, creating drawings and so on. But when we get right down to brass tacks, we have to make this thing hundreds of thousands, we hope, over a long period of time, we hope.
Right.
And any opportunity to eliminate a part has an exponential payoff down the line with reduced complexity, reduced integration costs, reduced number of things that can go wrong.
Right.
And even in our failure investigations post-complaint, imagine if there are fewer parts and if there's less complexity, those must be much more efficient.
Right. I would think it would reduce the risks too, right, to the end user.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Theoretically, if there are fewer things that can go wrong and it's more simple, then yes, there should be theoretically a lower risk. Although sometimes it doesn't work out that way. But generally speaking, it certainly allows us to put our focus and our resources where they belong, on customer safety and performance for the intended use.
Excellent. So, Roberta, once you've determined through your analysis kind of the must-haves and the non-essential parts, then you move on to steps 3 and 4 in the process, which is in the DFMA process, which is determining part count efficiency. So, perhaps you can walk us through that a little bit.
Sure, I'd be glad to. Just a word of warning here. It begins at this point to get a little theoretical, a little bit nerdy. We engineers thrive on that. We love that stuff, but it's a little more difficult to explain in a podcast, but I know that you've provided some great show notes that include references to tools, and all the formulas that we'll be referring to in today's podcast are there.
Yeah, so absolutely. For sure. Thank you.
So basically, I'll describe the process. Basically, what we do is, in order to determine the first value, we're trying to understand the count efficiency and where we are and how far we are away from an optimization of the number of parts we really need to make this device remove a staple, not to be a gripper that removes a staple necessarily.
Right.
And so the formula in this case is theoretical part count efficiency equals the theoretical minimum number of parts it takes to actually get a staple out of the paper, the total number of parts we currently have in our design. So the theoretical minimum number of parts divided by the total number of parts we have currently, times 100. So theoretically, to get a staple out, you probably just need one part.
Right.
But we currently have 10 parts when you count all the rivets and the jaws and everything in our claw design. So in our example, it's 1/10 times 100, or 10%. Now, there's a rule of thumb for part count efficiency. Our goal should be greater than 60%. If we have greater than 60%, according to Professor David Steenstra, and he's from Rose-Hulman Institute in Indiana, great book on design for manufacturability and assembly. This is our goal. There are other folks who say 45% is more basic. And it's not unusual. So we're kind of right in the ballpark there where we say, this is pretty typical, and it tells us that we really have opportunities to improve the efficiency of design.
Okay. Is there a reason that they chose 60%? You know, is that a magic number? What happens at the 60, let's say 50 to 60%?
You know, that's a really good, you know, I don't know. I don't know for sure. You know, that's a great question. Perhaps I can send a quick email over to Professor Steenstra. As a rule, he defines it as a rule of thumb, Stacey, which generally means there's no specific, you know, economic or regulatory basis or scientific basis for it, but rather just a goal that, I guess, you know, anytime you have not more than twice as many parts as you actually need to do the job. So 60% would represent that.
That makes sense, actually. Yeah.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Just to give everyone a ballpark. So currently we're at 10%. So there's a lot of work we can do on our staple remover.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So then obviously you determine the practical part count in these two steps. What comes next? Step 5.
Well, next we look at the number of interfaces, part-to-part interfaces. And again, we have some really fun formulas that, I just love this stuff. And I know your listeners do. We've got two different factors. We've got the N sub P, which is the number of parts, and then N sub I, the number of part-to-part interfaces. Okay. So when we look at our staple remover, we would count how many interfaces exist. So we know the total number of parts here is 10, as I took it apart and showed you.
Sure.
But then we've got interfaces, upper jaw to lower jaw, rivet to upper, rivet to lower, and so on. And once we do some mathematical gyrations, take a square root or two, we end up with the number, what we call the design for assembly complexity factor. And that tells us that complexity in design and in assembly exists not just based on the number of pieces we have to put together, but the number of interfaces among those pieces.
Okay.
So in plain language, I guess if you think about it, if you only had to insert, say, a screw into a panel,
right,
that's easier than, say, inserting a screw into a panel that then goes into a washer that then goes into another panel. Do you see what I mean? So it's the interfaces add complexity. So this is really what we're looking at in steps 4 and 5. And as part of that, on the back end, I always like to mention that we consider the part cost as well. You know, these are opportunities to really say, look, if my interfaces are into softer materials, do I really need to have such hardened steel fasteners, for example?
Sure, absolutely. And that makes sense because keeping the cost down in manufacturing is obviously good for the manufacturer, but it also is good for the end users because the cost should be less on a product that costs less to produce, right? So
absolutely.
Right. So it's important on both sides of the fence there.
It is, you're right.
That we're as efficient as we can be, not just for practicality, but also for financial reasons too.
Absolutely.
Roberta, you hopefully this is a good time to mention this. In the intro, you talked about Poka-Yoke. I think that's such a strange term, and you did briefly describe that, you know, what it is. But can you talk a little bit more about this term and why it's so important to this process, and maybe give us an example or two?
Sure. You know, I pulled up a photo this morning in hopes that I'd have a chance to show an example. Poka is hard to explain, you know, just verbally, but may I hold this up and show your audience if it will. So here we have an actual, if you can see that, medical device manufacturing laboratory, that the first picture with all the cables and guts everywhere.
Yes.
Now, if we present this kind of complex assembly environment to our fabricators of our product, this is going to be just a disaster waiting to happen. I hope that's showing well. Is it? Let me see.
Yeah, I think you lost it, but that's okay. It didn't show up. Yeah.
Okay, so this is Poka-Yoke is a way of preventing inadvertent mistakes. So as we look at kind of the mess in the one picture, we see how easy it would be to make a mistake in assembly of this complex part.
Right.
Versus, have you seen these popular pill packs? They're advertised on television a lot these days.
Yes.
In this image, if your listeners are able to see it, we've actually taken all the guesswork out of which medications a patient has to take at a given time. And actually, these are delivered to their house. It actually tells them what time, what day, what the medications are, and they're all in this handy pill pack. That is a great example of Poka-Yoke implemented.
Excellent. Thank you. That's an excellent example. So if for our listeners, what Roberta was showing was those pill packs that come pre-made, daytime stamped, and it has all the medication that a patient would need for a single dose, of each medicine. And it's hard when you look at that, Roberta. You can't even understand how someone could make a mistake with that, right? So it's all you need is in that one little pouch. It's stamped with the day and time that you're supposed to take it. So much more efficient than the mess of cords and components that we saw from the first picture, which kind of reminds me of, the old outlets when you'd have 52 plugs plugged into one outlet.
Yeah. and the sparks coming out. Yeah, exactly. So, and when we look at this in terms of manufacturability, some of the things that will apply will be designing self-aligning and self-locating screws and other parts so that we can't put them in upside down, or they're self-aligning. We don't have to get our big fingers into these little tight spaces. We just sort of drop it in and it self-aligns because it's weighted at the bottom, let's say, or there's a taper in the element that we're dropping it into. So these are examples of Poka-Yoke in design that makes assembly so much easier.
Excellent. So, so obviously there's considerations at that point of how you can manage your assembly to be as efficient and easy as possible. So we're going to move on then to the final 3 steps in the DFMA process, and beginning with identifying, handling inefficiencies. So obviously we've been talking about wanting and needing to be as efficient as possible. But obviously there will be inefficiencies that are identified. And when that happens, how do we handle them?
Sure. Well, there's some really simple ones just to start with by example. If you can imagine trying to pick up, let's say that you don't have, manicured fingernails or using tweezers, but you're having to pick up a tiny part.
Right.
Off of, an assembly mat. Imagine trying to grip that part. We've all had that experience when we drop our credit card, say in underneath or washer. It's almost impossible to pick up. So that is an example of an opportunity based on the size of the part, the slipperiness of the part, even the sharpness, the flexibility of the part. Those 4 elements: size, slipperiness, flexibility, and sharpness. Huge difference for us humans with our fingers when we're trying to handle parts. And we don't necessarily want to make it necessary to use tweezers, although sometimes tweezers and other handling objects are necessary. But what we don't eliminate when we look at tweezers, for example, is we don't eliminate the problem with tangling or nesting of parts. So imagine you have a bin of springs, for example, to assemble. Even if they're easy to pick up, let's say that they're big and they're not too slippery, they're all tangled within each other. Can you picture that?
Right, yes.
All the springs wrap around each other, and you got to turn one clockwise and one counterclockwise to try to get them apart. Sometimes we also have this with nesting parts. Which is just get one out of there. This is even more so an issue with small parts in assembly and manufacturing. So nesting can be a problem. Complex designs where you have maybe a little opening, but it's very small and everything wants to get stuck within that opening. These are easy opportunities to simplify assembly and to reduce cost and time. And I said I would mention something a little bit more complex. So just one other example, insertion challenges. If we can avoid small clearances, if we can build from the bottom up, so make our assemblies, if possible, such that we start with the platform, that fundamental piece I said that is always essential.
The base, right.
And build, right, even if it means we have to invert the assembly to do this, build from the bottom up so that, as you can imagine, if you were to put a plank on top and then ask your assembly crew to go underneath that into maybe the side or underneath in order to add some additional fasteners or fixtures, you've impeded their visibility, you've impeded the manual access. Now they have to come in, you've limited the degrees of freedom for how to access that area. Additionally, we want to look at things that require huge insertion forces, or tremendous dexterity.
Wow, there is so much to think about in this process.
Right.
It's not just the parts, not just the usability of the parts and the cost, but how easy they are to handle. It sounds like how easy or difficult it is to connect all the parts and do the typical things you need to do assembly. I'm just wondering, it seems like there's so many opportunities for even the best engineers doing this DFMA process to miss something. What is the likelihood of them catching 100% of these things the first time around? Or is this a process that circles back a couple of times?
Well, that's a great question. Thinking back to my own experience in manufacturing and design, these are generally iterative processes, as you alluded to. However, where normally we would start with the brainstorming and with different prototypes, and we'd eliminate some parts, and then we might perform user testing in the field or even just on the bench top where we determine whether we've actually made, just because we've made a difference in our specifications and part design doesn't mean that it's actually easier to handle, right? So we'd have to confirm that. And then perhaps we'd go back 2 or 3 times if need be and make modifications. But what I found is with these great tools that are available now and the theoretical calculations, the spreadsheets that allow us or require us, in fact, not to miss a consideration. Now, that doesn't mean we'll always get the answer right, but it means we won't forget to ask an important question. I find that these tools, which again, they're not something that we're selling, these are available in the public domain, are just extremely helpful in ensuring that, just reducing the likelihood that we're going to skip a step and have to go back time and again. And really, with the simpler designs of medical devices, as I've, when I've taught this course for some of my medical device manufacturing clients, with the simpler devices, it's usually one and done, one time through. If you have the right people in the room, the right tools, and if you understand the concepts before you start. If you're trying to learn as you go, obviously it'll take a little longer.
Of course, and that makes sense. I mean, some devices and some products in general outside of medical devices are simple design, and that's great. But not all of them can be that way. So, it just takes a little bit more intuition. Having gone through, I feel like if people have gone through the process many times, you're likely to ask more of the right questions and get to that end result quicker. So,
absolutely.
So once we've obviously been through steps, let's say 1 through 6, 1 through 7, we get to the point where we've kind of narrowed down the exact parts we need. We've developed our process for assembling them and how all of that needs to fit together, eliminated as many inefficiencies as we can. Then we need to start to scale up for manufacturer so that we can get this product out to its intended customer. So what other points should be considered then at this point to ensure that the device can be put together repeatedly, efficiently, and also maintained, as you alluded to, in a cost-effective manner?
Right. Oh, great question. And it's really step 8, right? It's the final, it's the kind of the cherry on top. Well, now we're really focusing at this point on step 8. We really move away from the assembly process specifically and more to an overall manufacturing process. And we want to focus, when we focus on design for manufacturability in this final step, we really want to ask ourselves a few questions. First, I guess the first thing is we'll ask whether hard tooling is required. Is this something we really need to invest hard tooling, like the hardened stainless steel tooling, like for molds?
Sure.
Have we selected the best technology to fabricate the parts? What about the best materials, not just for function, but also for cost? Have we looked at all the new technology that's available, Stacey? And I know we talk a lot these days about, computer-aided, software-aided manufacturing, automation. Yeah. And so really, these are the opportunities. This is the time to look at those issues. So it's not just about how to put each device together. It's really about a larger scale systemic view for manufacturing. Do we want to automate? Are there certain things that don't make sense to automate? Is it not cost effective at this point? But when we reach a certain, say, tipping point in the volume of product, maybe it will make sense then. Are the parts even shaped? I love this one. Are they even shaped for the implementation of future automation? So I love to begin with the end in mind, right? We can choose different shapes for our parts in the beginning when it doesn't cost us anything. We haven't ordered tooling. Why not, even if we're going to be manual for a while, why not make the parts such that they could be manually assembled and grasped, but also not need redesign for implementation to an automated assembly process? And then the last question I would ask myself in this phase is, is the supplier capable of meeting the specifications for the designs we've come up with? Because in many cases, it will need something original in order to avoid some of the standard difficulties with handling and assembly.
Right. So now you're talking about a vendor providing you with the exact piece or part to the very tight specifications that we're likely to have in medical devices. And if that's almost impossible to find or impossible to build, then it's going to make the whole assembly manufacture inefficient, right?
Exactly. So kind of circling back to where we started in the beginning when I explained the difference between design for assembly and design for manufacturability.
Right.
I think that manufacturability focuses more on cost. And this is why, because once we've done all the design work and the assembly considerations, then we need to make sure that it's affordable and that we have suppliers that can actually do this for us. Do it with high quality, repeatability, meeting all the standards, the quality standards that are required for our suppliers today, and of course, at affordable cost.
Yeah, there's nothing worse than getting down the road, putting the device on the market, and then having to go back and do change management, change protocol because now the part's not available anymore, or the specifications that you're getting have, it's off specification from what you were originally accounted for. So
by all means,
now.
It's much more efficient, less expensive to do it now. And I guess that's really the final takeaway as we look at DFMAs, that, a lot of us, speaking for myself as well, I lived in that world where design engineers were in one part of the world, and manufacturing engineers were in another part, and we finish our prototype and toss it over and say, good luck with that.
Yeah.
Well, not anymore. And not just because it doesn't make sense, but also because the regulations expect us to work more in partnership, including our suppliers that are external, to make sure that what we design is
part of streamlining, and getting it to market, not only efficiently, but cohesively. Like it just, if one person or one department isn't talking to the other, that leaves definite exposure, I would think, in terms of something going wrong, added chance of mistakes happening, or time to market even.
That's right. And the earlier on we can catch any mistakes that do occur, because of course there will always be opportunities for such, obviously the less expensive it is for us, but more importantly, because we're in the medical device industry, the safer our patients will be.
And that is the ultimate goal. And the real bottom line here is that you always have to think about the end user, which is the patient, and the safety. And I think that's what a lot of the regulatory agencies are looking for too, right? They want to know you've done it right, but ultimately they want to know that you've made your product to be the highest quality that it can be. And if everyone involved is working towards quality, then a lot of this stuff sort of works itself out. But thank you so much, Roberta. Amazing information. So much helpful knowledge, and I love how you broke it down into 8 steps, because it really is very usable for our listeners out there. Before we break, are there any resources our listeners can access that you'd point them to better grasp the potential efficiencies of DFMA?
Absolutely. And again, these will be in the show notes, but some of my absolute favorites include, I made reference to this wonderful, to Dr. Steenstra, Professor Steenstra,
yes,
in Indiana, and we'll have references
we'll include
there.
That in the show notes for sure. Yeah.
So his book, which comes out of Rose-Hulman, it's amazing. I also, of course, I really like the Medical Device Handbook that IVT Network published, in which we have a chapter that I think really elucidates this and gives a little bit of a different point of view than what I explained today, so that you can have even a more well-rounded understanding of DFMA considerations. And again, that's specifically for our industry. And beyond that, I would suggest, the Society of Manufacturing Engineering has some great videos on YouTube under Design for Manufacturing. If you just search, I would just recommend making sure that, it's a credible source. Just because it's on there doesn't mean it's credible. But Society of Manufacturing Engineers does have some really good, credible examples where you can just see the difference that it makes in an assembly process to make a few simple streamlines.
Excellent. We'll include all of those links in the show notes for our listeners, because there's some valuable information out there. We want them to be able to find that easily and efficiently. So, but thank you so much, Roberta. It's been such a pleasure having you back. What a thoughtful topic, and I'm glad that it's one that we were able to cover. So thank you to you for that. Thank you also to our producer, Ed Sullivan, and to the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. I also want to give a big shout out to all of you, our valued listeners. Remember, if you like Voices in Validation, we encourage you to subscribe in your podcast player of choice so you never miss an episode, and share it with your colleagues and online networks. For more information on the podcast and links from today's show notes, please visit www.ivtnetwork.com. And we'll be back again next week with more great interviews. Until then, make it a great week.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts, guests, or callers of this program do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, the United Podcast Network, its partners,